Thank you so much, Sheila. And everybody, thank you so much for joining us this evening, especially you, Preston. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And well, it's really, it's our pleasure. But thank you very much. So I guess, I mean, Sheila did such a great job. Let me just start off. We'll start kind of broad. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, well, I grew up in West Texas. I was born in Abilene and grew up in Midland, graduated from Midland High, then went to Baylor. That's where I met a young lady from Pennsylvania, Harriet Coker, and we got married our senior year. Worked in newspapers in Abilene, Waco, Orange, Texas, and then Lubbock, Texas, before moving into higher education communications and marketing on the administrative side rather than the academic side. And just I went into journalism just because I'd always wanted to write, not necessarily newspaper stories. Deep down, I wanted to write fiction and novels, but journalism and newspapers were a way to approach that. And so I've sort of written until I retired. I worked full time and then wrote on the side. And now that I've retired, I just write full time and do what I want.
Well, that sounds wonderful. But still, it's really impressive that you were able to write on the side when you were, busy working, and you've got a family. You're a family man too. Is that correct?
That's correct. Harriet and I have a son and a daughter, Melissa and Scott, and they are mature now with kids of their own. So they just were always accustomed to me writing in the evening and on weekends and so forth. It sort of kept me off the streets and out of jail.
No, I can understand that everybody needs a hobby. So you were a journalist and you said you knew you didn't want to just do the journalism of the work as writing as a journalist, but that you were also interested in fiction. Has that always been the case? Did it come around at a certain point in your life?
Well, one, I'd always wanted to write, and I think a lot of people always want to write, but you have to have some incentive, if you will. And the incentive for me was the birth of our son. And I was working at the newspaper in Lubbock and realized I was not going to be able, on a reporter's salary, to put my son through college, and I needed to start doing something. And at about that time, the Bantam, the mass market publisher out of New York, had their first Western contest, and they were promising $25,000 in prize money to the winner. And I thought, that'll
Wow.
pay for some tuition. So I started writing and wrote, and it was so long ago. I mean, it was done on a typewriter, an IBM Selectric, and not one of the correcting Selectrics. So it was a pain to do the final draft and try to get it perfect. But I wound up with the manuscript, sent it to Bantam. It didn't win, but then I had a manuscript, and so I started circulating it. And finally, Tower Publications, 5 years after I wrote it, published my first book, Hard Texas Winter. And then that just sort of opened up some doors for me in terms of meeting people like Elmer Kelton, who encouraged me to join Western Writers of America. And that opened up doors and contacts that have served me well to this day.
Well, that's amazing. And that's a great inspiration to want to put your kid through school. So you've described yourself as a Western fiction writer. What led you into this particular genre, and have you ever had a desire to write in a different genre?
One, the Bantam contest was part of it, because that was an easy fix, in the sense that I grew up in West Texas, was familiar with a lot of West Texas history, and that's the history of the cowboys and the American folk hero. So always loved that. And then when I started reading, I just loved American history, particularly that century between 1849 and the California Gold Rush, and then 1949, the year before I was born. And that was just to
Mm-hmm.
me exciting things to read about. But working full time, I didn't have the luxury of the spare time to travel and do a lot of the research that I needed. So that sort of focused me on fiction because I could write around the facts then and make up what I didn't know and not necessarily get called on it.
That's fair. So when you are writing, a historical fiction or a Western, um, when you do incorporate real characters, real life characters, or real events that have happened, how do you go about doing that so that, I mean, like you said, so that you don't have to know all the details, but how do you decide which ones to insert and which ones not to?
One, I look for things that are a little different and that aren't the typical. So I'm always looking for things that have sort of a humorous twist, if you will, or an odd fact, something that hadn't been covered. I really fell in love with Western history growing up in Midland. I guess one of the first trips that our parents took my brother and me to Ruidoso, New Mexico. Now, growing up in Midland, going to the mountains in Ruidoso, it was almost like being in the Swiss Alps. It was spectacular and beautiful, and
Mm-hmm.
so that was exciting. But one trip, I guess the first trip, they took us to Lincoln, New Mexico, where Billy the Kid made his fame and gunfights and just his famous escape from the Lincoln County Courthouse. And there I
Mm-hmm.
was, 10 years old, walking down the same stairs in the courthouse that Billy the Kid had trod. And that just sort of
Wow.
fascinated me. So when I went back home, my mom was always good about taking me to the library on Saturdays when she was getting her hair done or something like that. So I went to the library and would check out uh, books on Billy the Kid. And that just sort of got me even more fascinated as I learned the stories. And then as I began to write, I would always look again for those odd facts or those unusual things that most people would think are so insignificant they wouldn't include them in a story. But those were the things I liked, and with Billy the Kid and that the demise of Billy the Kid, that one I knew it so well that I could almost write it from memory in terms of what I wanted to do. But as I began to research, like the next volumes in the series, The Redemption of Jesse James and Mix Up at the OK Corral, that required
Mm-hmm.
more research, and I encountered just different things that I thought would lend themselves to the story. For instance, in Arkansas, the redemption of Jesse James is set during the Civil War in Northwest Arkansas, and that was a very turbulent place. You had Union sympathizers and you had Confederate sympathizers, and
Mm-hmm.
you never knew what troops or what army would be passing by. So, for their own protection and safety, lots of times people that were politically on opposite sides of the spectrum in the Civil War issues would live together. So if Confederate bushwhackers came by, they could walk outside and say, "Yeah, we're with the South. Go Confederacy." And if it was Union
Okay.
soldiers that came by, well, then the other family would go out and say, "Hey, we're with y'all." So just things like that uh, interested me. Another thing in that
Mm-hmm.
third book in the series, Mix Up at the OK Corral, one because there was some overlap between the events that happened at the OK Corral and the events affecting Billy the Kid, and my
Mm-hmm.
protagonist, H.H. Lomax, was at both. I had to have him sort of going back between Lincoln and Tombstone. And I had to have a reason for that made sense.
Sure.
And one of the things that I learned about Tombstone, as it turns out with a lot of other Western towns, particularly mining towns, is that they were overrun by rodents. And that got me to thinking, well, on those trips to Lincoln and back, he could be rustling cats and bringing them to Tombstone to sell. And I thought that was original and so forth. But later, as I
Yeah.
got deeper into things, I learned that that was fairly common. That people in the Old West recognized many times that cats were needed in mining towns, and they would collect them or steal them or buy them, and then take them in wagons and sell them for huge profits. So uh, that sort
Wow.
of that sort of opened up another area. I consider myself the world's leading living expert on cats in the Old West, and uh, no one's ever challenged me on that. So I'm going to say that it's valid. But that was fairly common, and back then, as I documented through research on newspapers.com, that there were basically cat drives, what I call cat drives, from the time of the San Francisco gold rush to the Klondike, where people would buy cats cheaply and sell them at an exorbitant price.
Wow. That I love those little tidbits. And obviously you must do, I would imagine you must do a good bit of nonfiction reading and research to come up to run across these things.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, I read more nonfiction than fiction for two
Hmm.
reasons. One, the research, and you can pick up information and you can learn things. And secondly, there are a lot of good fiction writers out there and so forth. And I just fear if I'm not careful, I'll pick up their ideas or their plot line and so forth. So I don't read probably as much fiction as I should, but that gives me more time to read the nonfiction.
Oh no, and that makes sense. So you've mentioned it a little bit, but maybe you'll go a little bit more in depth for us. One of the things I've noticed from reading several of your books is, like you said, you've got a very finely honed sense of humor, and it comes out very clearly in your book. Um, Even the serious ones will have moments of like, I guess, where there's a little bit something ludicrous will happen or silly, to kind of give everybody a little bit of comic relief. Has that always been a facet of your writing style? And how do you decide which approach you're going to take with a new project?
Well, one, I came from a family. There were four of us, my brother and me, and our parents, and we just always laughed a lot. We just had fun with things, and it just sort of became natural. Now, I don't consider myself the funny one in the family. My younger brother, he's the quick wit and hilarious one, and I tend to be more. Yeah, I could have responded to that with the perfect answer, but the answer doesn't come to me till a day and a half later. He was a quick wit, but what I've learned as I've written is to be able to hone the humor and to determine sort of techniques that I can use it and incorporate it into my works.
No, that makes sense. Um, and so when you're starting a project, do you must know, I guess, I'm assuming, that you have a pretty good idea whether you're going to take a serious take on a subject or whether you're going to take a more humorous one. Is that correct, or has a book surprised you? After you've done a little bit of work on it.
Um, yeah, generally I will know that like the books in the Lomax series were
Hmm.
ones that I was a pro. Well, let me backtrack. I had an editor at Bantam. His name was Greg Tobin, and he told me one time. He said, Preston, you write sort of funny. Now that's not necessarily something you want to hear from an editor because you're not quite sure what he means. And so I said, well, Greg, what do you mean by it? He says, well, you just have sort of uh, an odd take on some things, and you approach it in a way with plot twists and stuff that just lend themselves to humor. And he said, have you ever
Hmm.
thought about writing comic westerns? And my little brother was the funny one in the family, so no, I hadn't. but he
Mhm.
suggested that I do that, and I worked with BCI, Book Creations Incorporated. It was a book packager back in the 90s. And they came to me, they said, we just want this, in essence, a Forrest Gump for the Old West, and who's everywhere you'd want him to be. I mean, the things that are well known and documented. And so I said, okay, we'll do that. And that was all they said. So I came up with a name, and then when you do on like that with the publisher, you've got to provide them a very extensive, detailed outline and synopsis, which I was able to do, and then I just
Mhm.
worked off of that, and it was just it got to be great fun.
Oh,
They
good.
told me initially that they wanted me to write a one on Billy the Kid, which was fine because I love that and always wanted to write a Billy the Kid novel. A second
Uh-huh.
one, uh, wanted to do the OK Corral because that's such a standard in the Western mythology. And I wasn't quite sure on the third, the other one, but they wanted me to do Jesse James. Well, Jesse James is not one of my favorite Western heroes or villains. I don't particularly care for the
Sure.
man. But they said, well, sorry, you're going to have to do it. And so I said, okay. So what I did is I made Jesse James more of a peripheral character and
Mhm.
used that book set in the Civil War as sort of the coming of age novel for H. Lomax, my protagonist. And
Mhm.
oddly enough, it turned out to be probably maybe the favorite book I've ever written, just because there's such a range of emotion. Those are very tragic times during the Civil War, and
Yeah.
uh, so there was emotion there as well as humor and so forth. So uh, sometimes you go places you don't plan to go, and you have more fun than you ever anticipated you would.
Well, that's wonderful. I mean, I'm just glad to hear that you've had as much fun writing these books as I had reading them.
Oh, well, good. Well, yeah,
So,
it's
I'm sorry. Go on.
Well, I was just going to say, it gives me an excuse to do the research and learn about some of these major events in Old West history, and I enjoy it. And I'll give you another example that's of just sort of incorporating some humor. The next book that I'll have out, it's due for release May 13th, is called Too Much the Lion, a novel of the Battle of Franklin. And it
Mhm.
is I consider it my most serious and literary work. It is a uh, difficult tale and a sad tale in many ways. And I had to include some humor in it to try to lessen that. And
Sure.
it's all told from the Confederate side. And I came out with one of the little boys uh, telling his younger sister that they wouldn't have Christmas that year because the Yankees had shot Santa Claus.
Oh.
And so that was something that would carry through. And some of the other kids in there and another family, they were always fascinated by the passing Yankee troops, and they were always looking to see where their devil's horns were, and they never could find the horns or the antlers on the troops, and that lends itself to some humor along the way as well.
Mhm. No, that I mean, I think that's because I'm not very well read on the Civil War, but I know enough to know that the Battle of Franklin was late, and it didn't go well for the Confederacy. Is
No,
that the battle where they lost six Confederate
yes,
generals?
yes,
Yeah.
that's the
So
one, and uh,
yeah.
it a very tragic battle, and one that just in my mind lent itself well to a fictionalization and an account to try to make some sense out of it. It's told much like The Killer Angels by Michael Shara in terms of
Oh yes.
various viewpoints of the actual participants. There's not really any fictional characters per se in it. So it was fun and emotional to write as well, just because it was so tragic.
Oh yeah, no, I would imagine so. And you actually mentioned one of my favorite books ever, Killer Angels. Um, and so this leads me to ask, like, were you? I'm assuming you were influenced by that book to some extent. What are some of the other authors and books that you feel have inspired you in your work?
Well, to begin with, when I was a kid, Mark Twain, you encounter him in school, so he was very good. Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer,
Hmm.
Roughing It, some of those, Life on the Mississippi. I read all of those. So he was one during my childhood. Another one during that time was J. Frank Dobie with
Ah, yeah.
his books on the folk tales and the folk stories of the old west, like the Longhorns and the Mustangs. And the Longhorns was just one of the most riveting books I'd ever written as or read as a child. And I couldn't,
Hmm.
I kept going back to it because I just couldn't believe some of the things and the little details he would give about, like in a thunderstorm, how there would be so much electricity in the air that sometimes there would be sparks, a little mini lightning that would shoot between the horns of a longhorn, and
Wow.
that impressed me. And then the third one that was very influential was Ernie Pyle, the World War II correspondent. His books,
Hmm.
Brave Men, and This Is Your War, uh, very inspirational. One thing it showed me that you might be able to make a living as a journalist, writing. And then he was just so good at capturing the essence of World War II from the point of the GI and what the GI went through and
Hmm.
what he did. And he was probably the most beloved war correspondent in American history, and an exceptional writer. So so those were the ones that influenced me as a child. In terms
Hmm.
of professionally, the ones that were the most helpful, Elmer Kelton, who I got to know as a Western writer and was very encouraging and supportive of my work. And then Jeannie Williams, who I consider my writing mentor. She was in the Western Writers Hall of Fame, a past president of Western Writers of America, and became a very dear family friend, not just to me, but to Harriet and Scott and Melissa. And we visited her in her home in Arizona a few times, and she visited us when we lived in Lubbock. And she was
Hmm.
very encouraging, uh, provided me, I guess, encouragement during some very lean times, told me I had talent when I wasn't sure I had. It was worth going on with some of the writing, and maybe gave me a piece of advice that sticks with me to this day. At one point, she said, "Preston, I've seen a lot of writers with talent, but in the long run, perseverance always trumps talent. So just stick
Wow.
to it." And that's what I've
Hmm.
done, and it's paid off in a lot of ways. So those, from a professional standpoint, were the two, and then just uh, well, Michael Shar I mentioned with the Killer Angels.
Hmm.
Never had a chance to meet him, but a couple others. Douglas C. Jones, who wrote novels. He lived in Arkansas and wrote about Indian Territory and some Civil War novels. He had one of the best combinations of what I would call style and story. I mean, he told great
Oh.
stories, but he told it with a literary flair. And then another one that I enjoyed was Fred Grove, another Western writer. He won
Hmm.
4 or 5 Spur Awards and wrote what I would consider some comic novels. The Great Race and Match Race were a couple about quarter horse racing on the frontier, and they're just absolutely delightful stories. And was blessed to be able to meet Fred and spend some time with him. And he encouraged me to take up the mantle about writing sort of the comic westerns on horses, but I wasn't near the horseman he was. And while I took up some humor, I sort of left the horses to him to deal with.
No, sure, sure. Well, that's wonderful. So we've been talking a little bit about your work and a little bit about the influences of it. Let's look at the more technical stuff. Tell us a little bit about your writing process.
Well, first of all, I read and I observe. So I just look at things and consider how it could go into a fictional account and so forth. And you just pick up odds and ends in reading different things, and I look for those odd facts again. One that, on the mix up at the OK Corral, in doing some of the reading there was a story in one of the historical journals about a dance outside of Tombstone where uh, Curly Bill Brocious got drunk and went there and thought it'd be funny if he had all of the dancers stripped down to their underwear. And that was just too good to pass up. So I include that in the mix up at the OK Corral. And you have to be able to not only find it but work it into the plot, and you can do that after a while. So the research and just the observation is important. In terms of the mechanics, I wind up doing 3 drafts. The first draft is just to get something on the screen or on paper, because until you got that, you have nothing else to work with. The second draft is where I go through and try to tie up loose ends and fix holes in the plot, because when you start writing, you just attempt to get stuff on paper. It doesn't always mesh in terms of your plot line and some of the characters. So I get that resolved in the second draft. And then in the third draft, that's where I go in and really try to polish up the language and add the more colorful touches and just enhance the wording and all to make it enjoyable to read. And that generally is how it works with most of them. The on the Too Much the Line, the one that'll be out next month, I went through 5 drafts on it because it was so complicated to deal with. And this is what the complication was. I had so many major characters that I could not write it chronologically with each character. So I had to write each character, what happened to each character on each day. And then when I got all those done, then I had to go back in and insert them in chronological order. And that was the biggest mess I ever got into, because it was more difficult than I had anticipated, but probably still less difficult than trying to write it just chronologically. So I wound up with 5 drafts on that one. And then Harriet, she's a good editor, so she helps me out along the way and stuff, and it works out pretty well.
No, it sounds like it. So I have a question about a specific book, The Fleecing of Fort Griffin. That was like a crime caper almost. And it had a very convoluted, I don't want to ruin anything for anyone who hasn't read it, but it had a very convoluted kind of plot. Were you able to just write that straight through, or was it also the general 3-draft process, and you could kind of fix things as you went? I guess it was less complex than your new book.
Yeah, it was less complex, and yes, I wrote it straight through, but all of mine go with through three drafts and stuff, and that one too, and that one I guess would be considered my first comic novel. I wrote it in
Hmm.
I wrote it in 1990, and sold it to Doubleday for a Double D Western. Now, Double D Westerns were the premier line of Western uh, novels, really in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and so forth. And that had been one of my ambitions, is to get one published by Doubleday. So I got it sold, and
Uh-huh.
it was scheduled to come out in February of 1994. Well, Doubleday ended their Double D line of Westerns in December of 1993.
Oh
So
no,
I
no.
missed it by 2 months. And
I'm so
uh,
sorry.
yeah, it was, well, it actually worked out much better in this sense that I held on to it. And then when I retired, I pulled it, from the file and started uh, tweaking it a little bit. And then I had an opportunity with Wild Horse Press, which bought Aiken Press, the venerable Texas publisher. And I'd done some stuff with Aiken. And so the publisher of Wild Horse Press was interested in picking up some more of my books. And so that one was one that was picked up. So it was published, I believe, in 2014, and uh, it was it's one of my favorites, just because it has some good plot twists and some interesting characters. And I'll illustrate my research with that book. When I was working at Texas Tech, I spent a lot of time at the Southwest Collection, which was their
Hmm.
regional archive, doing research. And I'd look through old newspapers and stuff during my lunch hour in the evenings when I had spare time. And I read a lot of old newspapers, including the Frontier Echo, which was published first in Jacksboro and then later in Fort Griffin before it moved to Albany, where it was combined with the Albany newspaper. And I don't remember whether it was the Jacksboro uh, editions or the Fort Griffin editions, but there was a column or two different columns I encountered. One where this editor was sort of making fun of this rumor that a guy was coming to Fort Griffin to look for land so he could start a buffalo ranch to raise buffalo. Well, that's at a time when they're killing all the buffalo off. And so that just struck me as, well, that's sort of interesting. And
Hmm.
uh, I thought, that might lend itself to a novel. So I filed it back. And then in another column of this editor, he raised this question as what was the most pressing theological issue of the time. And keep in mind, this is in the aftermath of the Civil War. And the issue
Hmm.
that he said was that in a river baptism, does an amputee with a cork leg, does he and the leg both have to be fully immersed at the same time for the baptism to count? Now, that's funny and something I would never have thought of, but I just filed it
Right.
back. And when I started doing the fleecing of Fort Griffin, then what I wanted to do was come up with a itinerant preacher that could try to baptize this guy with a cork leg. And I
Hmm.
came up with the pastor G.W. God Willing Tuck as the
Yep.
pastor's name, and he becomes one of my favorite characters.
Well, I can definitely see why. You mentioned the Southwest collection at Texas Tech, and that's actually the in your introductions in the H.H. Lomax series. That's the repository that you have his papers, his personal papers being archived. Have you ever run into any issues using an actual real life repository?
Yes. All right. When I started, I went to the director of the Southwest Collection and said, "Hey, I want to do this. I want to make make this a repository for these fictional papers. Are you okay with that? And so forth. He said,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. He said, yes, just on the condition that you let us start a file on you and these papers so that it is documented that it's all fiction, so that I don't, 20 years from now when I'm gone, we don't have archivists running around here trying to find the non-existent H.H. Lomax papers. And so I laughed. I thought that's a long shot. But once the first three books came out, they were averaging 2 calls a month from people that were interested in seeing the Lomax papers. And they had to tell them that basically I was a liar. So because there weren't any. But
Not a lot. Creative
yeah,
license.
exactly. And so uh, it was fun, and I could not believe the reception that I got. People that read the books. I had an FBI agent in Minnesota call me and ask me if that was fiction or if it was true. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
well, am I under oath? And he is like, no, this is a non-business call. And so I told him, no, it's all fiction. And he says, I was afraid you were going to say that. Another uh, reader called me and wanted to know if it was fiction or not. And I said, well, I hate to tell you, but it's all fiction. It's all made up. And there was this long pause. And he said, this is one of the saddest moments of my life. And I'm like,
Oh.
I'm sorry. So that, just some things happen that you don't anticipate as a result of writing fiction. And I thought everyone would see it was and realize it was a joke, but apparently my
Mm-hmm.
introductions are so believable, and I have such an honest face that they can't believe it's actually fiction.
Well, like you said, I think it just goes to how believable you write. So one last question, because we're close to 7:45 now, and that's usually when we open things up for our readers to ask you questions. Would you be cool with that?
Sure.
Okay. Well, before I hand you over to them, one last question, and that's I've noticed that you've also written under the name Will Camp. How did that come about?
Well, during the 90s, I was publishing with 2 different publishers. And
Mm-hmm.
back then, they didn't want a competing title under the same name between rival publishers. So I
Mm-hmm.
came up uh, with the name Will Camp for what the books that I wrote as traditional Westerns. And then I used my actual name for the historical novels, just to differentiate between the two. As for the name Will Camp, it came from, I do a lot of genealogy research, and it came from a great
Mm-hmm.
great grandfather of mine who was quite the reprobate, a very colorful individual, not necessarily one that most people would be proud of, but I was very fascinated by him. And
Sure.
his last name Camp started with a C. And this is a little inside trick, uh, insider information. When you're writing mass market paperbacks, the small ones that are sold on the newsstand, generally you
Mm-hmm.
want a last name that starts with an a B, or a C, because generally those racks, when the distributors set them up, are arranged alphabetically. So if you've got an A,
Oh.
B, or C name, those tend to be at eye level, and you don't have to look down as far as if your last name was Zachary.
Oh,
So
that's so
that,
clever.
yeah, that's it just turned out his name worked for what I needed it to do. So He was a Civil War
that is
veteran and involved in Pickett's charge with the 10th Alabama at Gettysburg, and so forth. So,
wow.
but he was a drunkard.
Well, all right. Well, I'm going to open it up now to our readers. But first, Sheila, do you have any tips for everybody?
Yeah, so if you have a question or a comment for Preston, please dial *9 if you're calling in from a phone, or by pressing Alt-Y if you're using a computer to raise your hand and join the queue. We'll be keeping an eye on it, and then once your name is called, you can unmute yourself and begin speaking. You can unmute yourself by pressing *6 on your phone or by pressing Alt-A on your computer. You can give your name and the city you're in if you'd like, and then you can ask your question or make your comment for Preston, and then mute yourself again after you have made your comment. So it looks like we already have some people in the queue. Sally, you are first. You can unmute and go ahead.
Some of the authors have said that they have characters that they start out writing and have a specific goal in mind for that character, but somewhere along the line the character takes over and just does what they want to do, and it turns out to be an entirely different story. Have you ever had that happen to you?
Oh yeah, I mean there some of the things in the Lomax novel take twists that I didn't anticipate, and it's uh, just sort of odd how that will happen. I know was at a lecture that Elmer Kelton, a talk he was giving one time, and he was talking about a novel that was called Joe Pepper, and how the character in there just sort of took over. And I was still a young writer. I'd had a few books published, but Elmer was always gracious enough to mention new writers in his talks and stuff, and said, and Preston, Preston can tell you that's the fact, and it really is. It's hard to explain unless you've been there, but stuff just comes from somewhere beyond you. I mean, you just can't do it. One time my wife said, Preston, where do you come up with all of that stuff? I don't know. It just sort of happened.
Well, that's just interesting, because I know I was talking to one of the authors, and he just said a character just basically hijacked his book. Yeah,
that can definitely happen.
Well, I enjoyed the book, and I told Laura Jean, I said, none of that stuff that I've ever read about Pat Garrett or other those people, that stuff can't be right. And she said, no, that trunk is a bunch of fiction. I'm going like, thank you. you do write a very believable introduction. And I'm going, as soon as I thought, well, that's interesting. And then I got into the book, and I'm going like, no. That doesn't match with history that I know for a fact. No, that doesn't match. But it was great entertainment, and I thoroughly enjoyed the book. And I thank you for writing those kind of books, because I like humor in my books, and you definitely have a quirky sort of humor that kind of fits my humor. So thank you.
Well, good.
For your,
thank you. I'm glad you enjoy it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. All right, Kent, if you'd like to unmute yourself, I believe you're next.
Hi, I'm Kent from New Waverly.
Hi, Kent.
I was wondering, it seems like I noticed throughout history that women love those bad boys. And what is it about Billy the Kid that make women like Rosita and Sally and the others just lose their little minds over him?
Well, one, from what I've read, I would say two things. One, he was a bit of a charmer. He spoke Spanish. He spoke Spanish very well. Also, he was a good dancer, and that attracted the young ladies. And so, and I just think, he just had sort of a sly grin about him from the pictures in my image of him that I think some of them find attractive. And just another thing, just because he was sort of exciting in terms of the things that he did and the reputation that he had. So, you know, among historians and novelists, I mean, there are two Billies. There's sort of the mean pathological killer, and then the victim of circumstances. I much prefer the latter, that he just got caught up in things beyond his control, and he didn't mean to be a bad man, but that's the way he was perceived by many. I mean, I think Billy the Kid and Doc Holliday are the two most fascinating characters in Western history, and you know, I've enjoyed researching and writing about them and putting a little bit of my own touch on them. In fact, my protagonist in the memoirs of H.H. Lomax, to my knowledge, is the only fictional character in American literature that has had a tooth removed by the dentist, Doc Holliday. And he had it removed after spitting in Doc Holliday's whiskey. So that's the type of thing that lends itself to humor in my book.
And the fact that he was a con man was...
Oh, I'm sorry, Kent. Go ahead. My apologies.
I was just going to say how well of a con man he was, too. And, you know, he was, what, his early 20s, right?
Correct.
And what led him to being the way he is? I mean, was it just...
Well, you need to understand that Lincoln County, New Mexico, during that period was perhaps as corrupt a place in the United States as there was or maybe ever has been. And there were a lot of competing factions trying not just to make money, but in essence, to control the corruption so that they benefited from it. I look at it as Billy is a bit naive and just gets caught up in things that he doesn't fully understand. And his sense of right and wrong is knocked off center by what he sees and then how he has to react.
Mm-hmm. Sure, that makes good sense. Mm-hmm. Well, does anybody else have any questions? Mm-hmm. As we're getting close to the time when we're going to have to close up shop, but if anyone else has another question, I don't want to. All right, y'all. Well, I want to thank you so much, Preston, for joining us this evening and for answering all these questions and for writing such wonderful books.
Well, my pleasure. It's always glad to do something for libraries, particularly the Texas State Library and Archives. So it's been my pleasure.